I Am Malala, Chapter 3, by Malala Yousafzai. Chapter 3, Growing Up in a School. My mother started school when she was 6 and stopped the same term. She was unusual in the village, as she had a father and brothers who encouraged her to go to school. She was the only girl in class of boys. She carried her bag of books proudly in her school and claimed she was brighter than the boys. But every day she would leave behind her girl cousins playing at home, and she envied them. There seemed no point in going to school to just end up cooking, cleaning, and bringing up children. So one day she sold her books for 9 annas, spent the money on boiled sweets, and never went back. Her father said nothing. She says he didn't even notice, as he was off early every morning after a breakfast of cornbread and cream, his German pistol strapped under his arm, and spent his day busy with local politics or resolving feuds. Besides, he had 7 other children to think about. It was only when she met my father that she felt regret. Here was a man who had read so many books, who wrote the poems she could not read, and whose ambition was to have his own school. As his wife, she wanted to help him achieve that. For as long as my father could remember, it had been his dream to open a school. But with no family contacts or money, it was extremely hard for him to realize this dream. He thought there was nothing more important than knowledge. He remembered how mystified he had been by the river in his village, wondering where the water came from and went to, until he learned about the water cycle from the rain to the sea. His own village school had been just a small building. Many of his classes were taught under a tree on the bare ground. There were no toilets, and the pupils went to the fields to answer the call of nature. Yet, he says he was always lucky. His sisters, my aunts, did not go to school at all, just like millions of girls in my country. Education had been a great gift for him. He believed that lack of education was the root of all Pakistan's problems. Ignorance allowed politicians to fool people and bad administrators to be reelected. He believed schooling should be available for all, rich and poor, boys and girls. The school that my father dreamed of would have desks and library, computers, bright posters on the wall, and the most important, washrooms. My grandfather had a different dream for his youngest son. He longed for him to be a doctor, and as one of just 2 sons, he expected him to contribute to the household budget. My father's elder brother, Sid Ramaz, had worked for years as a teacher at a local school. He and his family lived with my grandfather, and whenever he saved up enough of his salary, they built a small concrete hajra at the side of the house for guests. He bought logs back from the mountains for firewood, and after teaching, he would work in the fields where our family had a few buffaloes. He also helped Baba with heavy tasks like clearing snow from the roof. When my father was offered a place for his A-levels at Johannesburg College, which is the best further education institution in Swat, my grandfather refused to pay for his living expenses. His own education dahi had been free. He had lived like a talib in the mosques, and the local people had provided the students with food and clothes. Tuition was free, but my father needed money to live on. Pakistan doesn't have student loans, and he had never even set foot in a bank. The college was in Sadi Shaf, the twin town of Menagora, and he had no family there with whom he could stay. There was no other college in Shangla, and if he didn't go to college, he would never be able to move out of the village and realize his dreams. My father was at his wits' end and wept with frustration. His beloved mother had died just before he graduated from school. He knew if she had been alive, she would have been on his side. He pleaded with his father, but to no avail. His only hope was his brother-in-law, Karachi. My grandfather suggested that he might take my father in so he could go to college there. The couple would soon be arriving in the village, as they were coming to offer condolences after my grandmother's death. My father prayed that they would agree, but my grandfather asked them as soon as they arrived, exhausted after the 3-day bus journey, and his son-in-law refused outright. My grandfather was so furious he would not speak to them for their entire stay. My father felt he had lost his chance and would end up like his brother, teaching a local school. The school where Uncle Khan Dada taught was in the mountain village of Swihur. about an hour and a half's climb from their house. It didn't even have its own building. They used a big hall in the mosque, where they taught more than 100 children, ranging from 5 to 15 years old. The people in Swahili were Gojars, Kashans, and Menans. We regard Menans as noble or landed people, but the Gudhars and the Kohetsnins are what we call hilly people, peasants who look after buffaloes. Their children are usually dirty, and they are looked down upon by Pashtuns, even if they're poor themselves. They are dirty, black, and stupid, people would say. Let them be illiterate. It is often said that teachers don't like to be posted to such remote schools and generally make a deal with their colleagues so that only one of them has to go to work each day. If the school was 2 teachers, each goes in for 3 days and signs the other in. If it has 3 teachers, each goes in for just 2 days. Once there, all they do is to keep the children quiet with a long stick, as they cannot imagine education will be any use to them. My uncle was more dutiful. He liked the hilly people and respected their tough lives. So he went to the school most days and actually tried to teach the children. After my father had graduated from school, he had nothing to do, so he volunteered to help his brother. There was luck. There his luck changed. Another of my aunts had married a man in that village, and they had a relative visiting called Nasor Pacha, who saw my father at work. Nasor Pacha had spent years in Saudi Arabia working in construction. A relative visiting called Nazir Pacha, who saw my father at work. Nazir Pacha had spent years in Saudi Arabia working in construction, making money to send back to his family. My father told him he had just finished school and had won a college place at Jahazim. He did not mention he could not afford to take it, as he did not want to embarrass his father. "Why don't you come live with us?" asked Nazir Pacha. "Oh, I was so happy. By God," says my father. Pacha, his wife, Bakatimi, Jaja, and their 2 sons became his second family. Their home was in Spalabandi, a beautiful mountain village on the way to the White Palace, and my father describes it as a romantic and inspirational place. My father went there by bus, and it seemed so big to him, compared to his home village, that he thought he'd arrived in a city. As a guest, he was treated exceptionally well. Jaja replaced his late mother as the most important woman in my father's life. When a villager complained to her that he was flirting with a girl living across the road, she defended him. "Zaudin is as clean as an egg with no hair," she said. "Look instead to your own daughter." It was in Spalbandi that my father came across women who had great freedom and were not hidden away in his own village. The women in Spalbandi had a beautiful spot on top of the mountain where only they could congregate to chat about their everyday lives. It was unusual for women to have a special place to meet outside the home. It was also there. The women of Spalbandi had a beautiful spot on top of the mountain where only they could congregate to chat about their everyday lives. It was unusual for women to have a special place to meet outside the home. It was also there that my father met his mentor, Akbar Khan, who, although he had not gone to college himself, lent my father money so he could. Like my mother, Akbar Khan may not have had much of a formal education, but he had another kind of wisdom. My father often spoke of the kindness of Akbar Khan and Nasir Pacha to illustrate that if you help someone in need, you might also receive unexpected aid. My father arrived at college at an important moment in Pakistan's history. The summer, while he was walking in the mountains, our dictator, General Zia, was killed in a mysterious plane crash, which many people said was caused by a bomb hidden in a crate of mangoes. During my father's first term at college, national elections were held. Each were won by Benazir Bhutto, daughter of the prime minister who had been executed when my father was a boy. Benazir was our first female prime minister, and in the Islamic world. Suddenly, there was a lot of optimism about the future. Student organizations, which had been banned under Zia, became very active. My father quickly got involved in student politics and became known as a talented speaker and debater. He was made General Secretary of Puktan Students' Federation, which wanted equal rights for Pashtuns. The most important jobs in the army, bureaucracy, and government are all taken by Punjabs because they come from the biggest and most powerful province. The other main students' organizations was Islamic Jamaat-e-Talaba, the student wing of the religious party Jamaat-e-Islami, which was powerful in many universities in Pakistan. They provided free textbooks and grants to students, but held deeply intolerant views, and their favorite pastime was to patrol universities and sabotage music concerts. The party had been so close to General Zia and done badly in the elections. The president of the students' group of Jazabay College was Eshan Hanakane. Though he and my father were great rivals, they admired each other and later became friends. Hakwani says he is sure my father would have been president of the PSF and became a politician if he had been from a rich Khan family. Student politics was all about debating and charisma, but party politics required money. One of their first most heated debates in that first year was over a novel. The book was called The Satanic Verses of Salama Rushdie, and it was a parody of the life of the prophet BPUH set in Bombay. Muslims widely considered it blasphemous, and it provoked so much outrage that it seemed people were talking of little else. The odd thing was no one had even noticed the publication of the book to start with. It wasn't actually on sale in Pakistan, but then a series of articles appeared in Urdu newspapers by a mullah close to our intelligence service, berating the book as offensive to the prophet. PBUH, and saying it was the duty of good Muslims to protect. Soon mullahs all over Pakistan were denouncing the book, calling for it to be banned, and angry demonstrations were held. The most violent took place in Islamabad on February 12, 1989, when American flags were set alight in the front of the American Center, even though Rushdie and his publishers were British. Police fired into the crowd, and 5 people were killed. The anger wasn't just in Pakistan. 2 days later, Ayatollah Khomeini, the supreme leader of Iran, issued a fatwa calling the Rushdie's assassination. My father's college held a heated debate in a packed room. Many students argued that the book should be banned and burned, and the fatwa upheld. My father also saw the book as offensive to Islam, but suggested, "First, let's read the book, and then why not respond with our own book?" He ended by asking in a thundering voice, my grandfather would have been proud of, "Is Islam such a weak religion that it cannot tolerate a book written against it? Not my Islam." For the first few years after graduating from Jahanzib, my father worked as an English teacher in a well-known private college, but the salary was low, just 1,600 rupees a month, around $90, and my grandfather complained he was not contributing to the household. It was also not enough for him to save for the wedding he hoped for to his beloved Tor Pikai. One of my father's colleagues at the school was his dear friend Moham Naeem Khan, who once generously smashed his clay money box full of savings to help my father financially. He and my father had studied for their bachelor's and master's degrees in English together and were both passionate about education. They were also both frustrated as the school was very strict and unimaginative. My father longed for freedom that would come with running his own school. He wanted to encourage independent thought and hated the way the school he was in rewarded obedience above open-mindedness and creativity. So when Naeem lost his job after a dispute with the college administration, they decided to start their own school. Their original plan was to open a school in my father's village of Shahpur, where there was a desperate need. Like a shop in a community where there are no shops, he said. But when they went there to look for a building, there were banners everywhere advertising a school opening. Someone had beaten them to it. So they decided to set up an English language school in Minagora. As the government schools were failing, private English medium schools offered better education. As my father was still teaching, Naeem wandered the streets looking for somewhere to rent. One day he called my father excitedly to say he'd found the ideal place. It was the ground floor of a 2-story building in a well-off area called Lendikas, with a walled courtyard where students could gather. The previous tenants had also run a school, the Ramadan School. The owner had called it that because he had once been to Turkey and seen a Ramadan hotel. But the school had gone bankrupt, which perhaps should have made him think twice. Also, the building was on the banks of a river where people threw their rubbish, and it smelled foul in the hot weather. My father went to see the building after work. It was a perfect night with stars and a full moon just above the trees, which he took to be a sign. I felt so happy, he recalls. My dream was coming true.
Naeem and my father invested their entire savings of 60,000 rupees. They borrowed 30,000 rupees more to repaint the building, rented a shack across the road to live in, and went from door to door trying to find students. Unfortunately, the demand for English tuition turned out to be low, and there were unexpected drains on their income. My father's involvement in political discussions continued after college. Every day, his fellow activists came to the shack or the school for lunch. "We can't afford all this entertaining," Naeem would complain. It was also becoming clear that while they were best friends, they found it hard to work as business partners. On top of that, there was a stream of guests from Shangla now that my father had a place for them to stay. We Pashtuns cannot turn away relatives or friends, however inconvenient. We don't respect privacy, and there is no such thing as making an appointment to see someone. Visitors can turn up wherever they wish and can stay as long as they want. It was a nightmare for someone trying to start a business, and it drove Naeem to distraction. He joked to my father that if either of them had relatives to stay, they should pay a fine. My father kept trying to persuade Naeem's friends and family to stay so he could be fined too. After 3 months, Naeem had had enough. "We are supposed to be collaborating, collecting money and enrollment fees. Instead, the only people knocking on our doors are beggars. This is a Herculean task," he added. "I can't take it anymore." By this time, the two former friends were hardly speaking to each other and had to call in local elders to mediate. My father was desperate not to give up the school, so agreed to pay Naeem a return on his share of the investment. He had no idea how. Fortunately, another old college friend called Hidaratullah stepped in and agreed to put up the money and take Naeem's place. The new partners again went from door to door, telling people they had started a new kind of school. My father is so charismatic that Hidaratullah said he is the kind of person who, if invited to your house, will make friends with your friends. But while people were happy to talk to him, they preferred to send their children to established schools. They named it the Kushal School after one of my father's great heroes, Kushal Khan Khattak, the warrior poet from Akora, just south of Swat, who tried to unify all Pashtun tribes against the Mongols in the 17th century. Near the entrance, they painted a motto composed by Naeem Khan: "We are committed to build for you the call of the new era." My father also designed a shield with a famous quote from Katu in Pashto: "I girt my sword in the name of Afghan honor." My father wanted us to be inspired by our great hero, but in a manner fit for our times, with pens and not swords, just as Khattak had wanted the Pashtuns to unite against a foreign enemy. So we needed to unite against ignorance. Unfortunately, not many people were convinced. When the school opened, they had just 3 students. Even so, my father insisted on starting the day in style by singing the national anthem. This, his nephew Aziz, who had come to help raise the Pakistan flag. With so few students, they had little money to equip the school and so ran out of credit. Neither man could get any money from their families, and Hidatullah was not pleased to discover that my father was still in debt to lots of people from college. So they were always receiving letters demanding money. There were worse in store when my father went to register to school. After being made to wait for hours, he was finally ushered into the office of the official of schools, who sat behind towering piles of files surrounded by hangers on drinking tea. "What kind of school is this?" asked the official, laughing at his application. "How many teachers do you have? 3? Your teachers are not trained. Everyone thinks they can open a school just like that." The other people in the office laughed along, ridiculing him. My father was angry. It was clear the official wanted money. Pashtuns cannot stand anyone belittling them, nor was he about to pay a bribe for something he was entitled to. He and Hidatullah hardly had money to pay for food, let alone bribes. The going rate for registration was about 13 rupees, more if they thought you were rich. And schools were expected to treat officials regularly to a good lunch of chicken or trout from the river. The education officer would call to arrange an inspection, then give a detailed order for his lunch. My father used to grumble, "We're a school and not a poultry farm." So when the official angled for a bribe, my father turned on him with all the force of his years debating. "Why are you asking all these questions?" he demanded. "Am I in an office? Or am I in a police station or a court? Am I a criminal?" He decided to challenge the officials to protect other school owners from such bullying and corruption. He knew what to do. This he needed, some power of his own. So he joined an organization called the SWAT Association of Private Schools. It was small in those days, just 15 members, and my father quickly became vice president. The other principals took paying bribes for granted, but my father argued that if all the schools joined together, they could resist. "Running a school is not a crime," he told them. "Why should you be paying bribes? You are not turning brothels. You are educating children. Government officials are not your bosses." He reminded them, "They are your servants. They are taking salaries and have to serve you. You are the ones educating their children."
He soon became president of the organization and expanded it until it included 400 principals. Suddenly, the school owners were in position of power, but my father has always been a romantic rather than a businessman, and in the meantime, he and Helidatura were in such desperate straits that they ran out of credit with the local shopkeeper. It could not even buy tea or sugar. To try and boost their income, they ran a sweet shop at a school, going off in the mornings and buying snacks to sell to the children. My father even once bought maize and stayed up late at night making and bagging popcorn. "I would get very depressed and sometimes collapse seeing the problems all around us," said Haidatullah. "But when Zadon is in a crisis, he becomes strong and his spirits high." My father inserted that they needed to think big. One day, Haidatullah came back from trying to enroll pupils to find my father sitting in the office talking about advertising with the local head of Pakistan TV. As soon as the men had gone, Haidatullah burst into laughter. "Zadon, we don't even have a TV," he pointed out. "If we would advertise, we won't be able to watch it." But my father is an optimistic man and never deterred by practicalities. One day, my father told Haidatullah he was going back to his village for a few days. He was actually getting married, but he didn't tell any of his friends in Mandgora, as he could not afford to entertain them. Our weddings go on for several days of feasting. In fact, as my mother often reminds my father, he was not present for the actual ceremony. He was only there for the last day, when family members held a Quran and a shawl over their heads and held a mirror for them to look into. For many couples in arranged marriages, this is the first time they see each other's faces. A small boy was brought to sit on their laps to encourage the birth of a son. It is our tradition for the bride to receive furniture, or perhaps a fridge from the family or some gold from the family. My grandfather would not buy enough gold, so my father had to borrow some more money to buy bangles. After the wedding, my mother moved in with my grandfather and my uncle. My father returned to the village every 2 or 3 weeks to see her. The plan was to get his school going. Then once it was successful, send for his wife. But Baba kept complaining about the drain on his income and made my mother's life miserable. She had a little money of her own, so they used it to hire a van, and she moved to Mingora. They had no idea how they would manage. "We just knew my father didn't want us there," said my father. At that time, I was unhappy with my family, but I later was grateful, as it made me more independent. He had, however, neglected to tell his partner, Haidatullah, was horrified when my father returned to Mangora with their wife. "We're not in position to support a family," he told my father. "Where will she live?" "It's okay," replied my father. "She will cook and wash for us." My mother was excited to be in Mangora. To her, it was a modern town. When she and her friends had discussed their dreams as young girls by the river, most had just said they wanted to marry and have children and cook for their husbands. When it was my mother's turn, she said, "I want to live in the city and be able to send out for kebabs and naan instead of cooking it in myself." However, life wasn't quite what she expected. The shack had just 2 rooms. Once where Haidatullah and my father slept, and one which was a small office. There was no kitchen, no plumbing. When my mother arrived, Haidatullah had to move into the office and sleep on a hard wooden chair. My father consulted my mother on everything. Pakai helped me resolve my confusion on this, he would say. She even helped whitewash the school wash, holding up the lanterns so they could paint when the light went off in power cuts. Zadulon was a family man, and they were usually close, said Hadutala. While most of us can't live with our wives, he couldn't be without his. Within a few months, my mother was expecting. Their first child, born in 1995, was a girl and stillborn. I think there was some problem with hygiene in that muddy place, says my father. I assumed women could give birth without going to hospital, as my mother and my sisters had in my village. My mother gave birth to 10 children in this way. The school continued to lose money. Months would pass, and they would not pay the teachers' wages or school rent. The goldsmith kept coming and demanding his money for my mother's wedding bangles. My father would make him good tea and offer him biscuits in the hope they would keep him satisfied. Hadutula laughed. You think he will be happy with tea? He wants his money. The situation became so dire that my father was forced to sell the gold bangles. In our culture, wedding jewelry is a bond between the couple. Often women sell their jewelry to help set up their husbands in business or to pay their fares to go abroad. My mother had already offered her bangles to pay for my father's nephew to go to college, which my father had rashly promised to fund. Fortunately, my father's cousin, Jahan Sher, had stepped in, and she did not realize the bangles were only partly paid for. She was then furious when she learned that my father did not get a good price for them. Just when it seemed matters could not get worse, the area was hit by flash floods. There was a day when it did not stop raining, and in the late afternoon there was a warning of flooding. Everyone had to leave the district. My mother was away, and Hadatullah needed my father to help him move everything up to the first floor, safe from the fast-rising water. But he couldn't find him anywhere. He went outside shouting, "Zalun! Zalun!" The search almost cost Hadatullah his life. The narrow street outside the school was flooded totally, and he was soon up on his neck in water. There were live electric cables hanging loose and swaying in the wind. He watched, paralyzed with fear, as they most touched the water. Had they done so, he would have been electrocuted. When he finally found my father, he learned that he had heard a woman crying, that her husband was trapped in the house, and he had rushed to save him. Then he helped save their fridge. Hadatullah was furious. "You saved this woman's husband, but not your own house?" he said. "Was it because of the cry of the woman?" When the waters receded, they found their home and their school destroyed. The furniture, carpets, books, clothes, and the audio system entirely caked in thick, foul-smelling mud. They had nowhere to sleep and no clean clothes to change into. Luckily, a neighbor called Mr. Arman Undan took them in for the night. It took them a week to clear the debris. They were both away then. 10 days later, there was a second flood, and the building again filled with mud. Shortly after, they had a visit from an official WAPDA, the water and the power company, who claimed their meter was rigged and demanded a bribe. When my father refused, a bill arrived with a large fine. There was no way they could pay this, so my father asked one of his political friends to use his influence. It started to feel as though the school was not meant to be, but my father would not give up on his dream so easily. Besides, he had a family to provide for. I was born on July 12, 1997. My mother was helped by a neighbor who had delivered babies before. My father was in the school waiting, and when he heard the news, he came running. My mother was worried about telling him he had a daughter, not a son. But he says he looked into the eyes and was delighted. "Malala was a lucky girl," says Hadatullah. "When she was born, our luck changed, but not immediately. On Pakistan's 50th anniversary of 14th August 1997, there were parades and commemorations throughout the country. However, my father's friend Ishan Huluk organized a sit-in protest to show that there was nothing to celebrate, as SWAT had only suffered since it had merged with Pakistan. They wore black armbands to protest, saying the celebrations were for nothing, and were arrested. They had to pay a fine they could not afford. A few months after I was born, the 3 rooms above the school became vacant and we all moved in. The walls were concrete and there was running water, so it was an improvement on our shabby house. But we were still very cramped. It was very sharing in with Hadatullah, and we almost always had a guest. The first school was mixed primary school, and very small. By the time I was born, it had 5 to 6 teachers and around 100 pupils, paying 100 rupees a month. My father was a teacher, accountant, and principal. He swept the floors, whitewashed the walls, and cleaned the bathrooms. He used to climb up electricity poles to hang banners advertising the school. Even though he was afraid of heights, that when he got to the top of the ladder, his feet shook. If the water pump stopped working, he would go down the well to repair itself. When I saw him disappear down there, I would cry, thinking he wouldn't come back. After paying the rent and salaries, there was little money left for food. We drank green tea, as we could not afford milk for regular tea. But after a while, the school started to break even, and my father began to plan a second school, which he wanted to call the Malala Education Academy. I had the run of the school as my playground. My father tells me even before I could talk, I would toddle into classes and talk as if I were a teacher. Some of the female staff, like Miss Uluft, would pick me up and put me on their laps as if I were their pet, or even take me home with them for a while. When I was 3 or 4, I was placed in classes for much older children. I used to sit and wonder, listening to everything they were being taught. Sometimes I would mimic the teachers. You could say I grew up in a school. As my father had found with Naeem, it is not easy to mix business and friendship. Eventually, Hadidullah left to start his own school, and they divided the students, each taking 2 or 4 years. They did not tell their pupils, as they wanted people to think the school was expanding and had 2 buildings, though Hidayatullah and my father were not speaking at the time. Hidayatullah missed me so much. He used to visit me. It was while he was visiting one afternoon in September 2001 that there was a great commotion and other people started arriving. They said there had been a big attack on a building in New York. 2 planes had fallen into it. I was only 4, too young to understand. Even for the adults, it was hard to imagine. The biggest buildings in SWAT are the hospital and the hotel, which are 2 or 3 stories. It seemed very far away. I had no idea what New York and America were. The school was my world, and my world was the school. We did not realize that then 9/11 would change our world too and bring war into our valley.